February 7, 1943. New Guinea. The jungle air hangs thick with moisture and the smell of rotting vegetation. Private First Class Daniel McKay crouches behind a fallen mahogany log, his Springfield rifle hot against his palms. Behind him, the narrow mountain pass cuts through dense rainforest, leading to the Allied supply depot 2 miles back. In front of him, through the tangle of vines and ferns, he can hear them. Japanese infantry moving through the undergrowth, the rustle of equipment, the occasional bark of orders in a language he doesn't understand. The radio on his hip crackles. Captain Holland's voice cuts through static. All units, fall back to secondary position. Repeat, all units withdraw immediately. Enemy force too large. Fall back now. McKay's hand moves to the radio transmit button, then stops. His jaw tightens. He looks at the pass, at the single muddy trail that winds between cliffs too steep to climb, and he makes a calculation. If the Japanese take this pass unopposed, they'll be at the supply depot in 90 minutes. 300 wounded men are being evacuated from that depot right now, loaded onto trucks that can barely navigate the mountain roads. They need time. Someone has to give them that time. McKay releases a radio without responding, checks his ammunition, 80 rounds for grenades, 1 bayonet, and settles deeper into his position. He's not retreating. He's staying. And he's about to turn this jungle pass into a killing ground. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. To understand why a 24-year-old logger from Oregon would disobey a direct order and choose almost certain death over retreat, you need to understand what happened 3 weeks earlier at the Camusi River. McKay's unit had been part of a rear guard action covering an Allied withdrawal. The plan was simple. Hold the river crossing for 6 hours, then fall back under cover darkness. But the Japanese attacked earlier than expected. With more force than intelligence had predicted, the crossing became a slaughter. McKay watched men drown in the river, weighed down by their packs, while Japanese machine guns raked the water. He watched Lieutenant Chun take a bullet through the throat while dragging a wounded private towards safety. He watched his best friend, a kid from Boston named Tommy Rizzo, step on a mine that scattered him across 20 yards of jungle. McKay survived because he was lucky, because he'd been positioned on the far bank providing covering fire, because fate is arbitrary and cruel. 73 men went into that action. 28 came out. McKay carried that math with him every day after. 45 men dead because command had miscalculated, because intelligence had failed, because someone higher up the chain had made decisions based on maps and reports instead of mud and blood. He'd obeyed orders at Camusi. He'd retreated when told to retreat. And 45 men had died anyway. So when Captain Holland's voice crackled over the radio ordering another withdrawal, another retreat in the face of another miscalculated enemy force, something in McKay snapped. Not rage, not despair, just a cold, clear certainty that following orders wasn't the same thing as doing what was right. McKay had grown up in the timber country of western Oregon, in a town called Alsea where the main industries were logging and leaving. His father had worked the lumber camps until a widowmaker, a falling branch, crushed his spine and left him in a wheelchair at 42. McKay learned early that life was precarious, that one moment of inattention could end everything, that the forest didn't care about your plans or dreams. He started working the lumber camps at 16, lie about his age, sending money home to help his mother care for his father and 3 younger sisters. The work was brutal. Felling trees that had stood for centuries, dragging logs through mud, operating equipment that could kill you if you made one mistake. But it taught McKay things the Army couldn't teach. It taught him patience. It taught him to read terrain, to understand angles and weight distribution, to calculate risks in real time. It taught him that panic killed, that slow and steady kept you alive, that the man who kept his head when chaos erupted was a man who went home at the end of the day. Those lessons served him well in the jungle. While other soldiers thrashed through the undergrowth, McKay moved like he was still in the Oregon forest, quiet, economical, reading the land. While other soldiers fired wildly at shadows, McKay took his time, aimed carefully, made every shot count. His sergeants noticed. His fellow soldiers noticed. They started calling him Timber because he was solid, unshakable, The kind of man you wanted next to you when things went bad. The Japanese advance scouts appeared 15 minutes after McKay made his decision to stay. 3 men, moving cautiously through the jungle, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the undergrowth. They were good soldiers, disciplined, alert, trained, but they weren't expecting resistance. Intelligence had reported the Americans were withdrawing. The pass should have been clear. McKay watched them through his rifle sights, controlling his breathing, waiting for the perfect moment. He'd learned in the lumber camps that timing was everything. Pull the saw too early and you waste energy. Wait too long, and the tree falls the wrong way and kills you. Combat was the same. He let the scouts move deeper into the kill zone, let them cluster together near a bend in the trail, where the jungle closed in tight on both sides. Then he fired. The Springfield bucked against his shoulder. The lead scout dropped instantly, a red mist hanging in the humid air where his head had been. McKay worked the bolt, smooth, practiced, the motion as natural as breathing, and fired again. The second scout spun and fell, clutching his chest. The third scout dove for cover behind a termite mound, bringing his rifle up, searching for the shooter. McKay fired a third time. The bullet punched through the termite mound and through the man behind it. 3 shots, 3 dead men, 7 seconds. McKay immediately rolled left, moving 10 yards through the undergrowth before settling into a new position behind a stand of bamboo. You never stayed where you shot from. That was rule 1. Silence crashed over the jungle like a physical weight. The insects had stopped their constant buzzing. The birds had fled at the sound of gunfire. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. McKay reloaded his rifle, hands steady, and waited. He knew what came next. The scouts were overdue to report. The main force would send more men to investigate. They'd find the bodies, realize the pass was defended, and then they'd have to make a choice. Commit to forcing the pass or find another route. McKay was betting they'd commit. The terrain around Wairopi was brutal. Cliffs, ravines, jungle so thick you needed machete to move 10 feet. The pass was the only viable route for moving troops and supplies quickly. They'd come, and McKay would be waiting. 20 minutes later, he heard them. Not 3 men this time. More, maybe 20, maybe 30, moving with less caution now. Angry about their dead scouts, confident in their numbers. They entered the pass in a staggered column. Professional spacing, weapons ready. McKay had positioned himself 30 yards up the trail, elevated slightly on a small ridge that gave him a clear field to fire down the length of pass. He'd learned in the forest that elevation was everything. Height meant advantage. Height meant you controlled the engagement. He waited until 15 men were visible in the kill zone, then opened fire. The Springfield wasn't an automatic weapon like the Japanese Type 100 submachine guns, or even the American bars. It was a bolt-action rifle, old-fashioned, requiring manual operation between each shot, but in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, someone who'd spent years calculating angles and distances, someone who understood patience and precision, it was devastatingly effective. McKay fired, worked the bolt, acquired the next target, fired again. Each shot was aimed deliberate, purposeful. Center mass, the largest target, the highest probability of a hit. He didn't try for headshots or fancy marksmanship. He just put rounds into chests and stomachs and dropped men where they stood. The Japanese soldiers scattered, diving for cover, returning fire wildly into the jungle. Bullets snapped through the leaves around McKay, thudding into tree trunks, ricocheting off rocks. But they didn't know where he was. They were shooting at shadows, at muzzle flash, at guesses. McKay stayed calm, stayed hidden, kept firing. When his first clip ran dry, 5 rounds, he reloaded smoothly, muscle memory from 10,000 practice repetitions taking over. Another clip, 5 more shots, 5 more men down. The Japanese broke, retreating back down the pass, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. McKay had killed 11 men in less than 3 minutes. He shifted position immediately, moving 40 yards to the right, finding new cover behind a fallen tree. His heart was pounding now, adrenaline flooding his system, but his hands remained steady. This was just beginning. The Japanese officer in command of the advance force, Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, stood behind a large boulder 200 yards down the pass and tried to make sense of the tactical situation. His orders were clear: secure the pass, advance to the Allied supply depot, capture or destroy it. Speed was essential. The Americans were retreating, disorganized, vulnerable. This should have been a simple march followed by a quick assault. Instead, his scouts were dead, and he'd just lost 11 men in a brief, brutal engagement. Takahashi was an experienced officer. He'd fought in China, in the Philippines, in the early weeks of the New Guinea campaign. He knew what organized resistance looked like. This wasn't it. This was something different. One sniper, maybe two at most. Well-positioned, well-trained, but ultimately just 1 or 2 men against his entire company of 90 soldiers. The math was simple. Overwhelming force would prevail. Takahashi gave the order. Full assault, 3 squads advancing simultaneously. 1 up the center of the pass, 1 on each flank moving through the jungle, suppressing fire from the rear. They would flush out this sniper and crush him under sheer weight of numbers. It was a sound tactic. It should have worked. But Lieutenant Takahashi didn't know. He was facing a man who'd spent 8 years working in forests where one mistake meant death, who'd learned to read terrain like other men read newspapers, who understood fields of fire and angles of approach with an intuitive clarity that came from experience, not training manuals. McKay heard them coming before he saw them. The jungle was dense but not silent. Boots on mud made sound. Equipment jangling made sound. Men breathing hard in the oppressive humidity made sound. He tracked the approaching squads by ear, building a mental map of their positions, their speed, their likely routes. The center squad would come up the pass itself, using the clear trail for speed. The flanking squads would move slower, fighting through the undergrowth, but they'd try to gain elevation to fire down into a suspected position. McKay had already planned for this. He'd been moving constantly since the last engagement, and his new position gave him overlapping fields of fire on both the pass and the likely flanking routes. More importantly, he'd spent the last 20 minutes preparing a surprise. McKay had 4 grenades. He'd taken 2 of them and rigged a simple trap. Grenades tied to a vine stretched across the trail at ankle height. Pins pulled just enough that any tension would release them. It was crude but effective. The jungle provided natural materials. Vines, rocks for weight. The grenades themselves. McKay had built similar rigs in the lumber camps to trigger warning systems when widowmakers were hanging in the canopy. Same principle, deadlier application. He settled into his position behind a massive buttress root of a strangler fig, rifle rested on a natural shelf of wood, and waited. The center squad hit his tripwire first. The lead soldier's boot caught the vine. There was a half second of confused resistance as the soldier tried to figure out why his leg wouldn't move forward, and then both grenades detonated simultaneously. The explosion was massive in the confined space of the pass, amplified by the surrounding terrain. Shrapnel and concussive force tore through the squad. Men screamed. Bodies flew backward. The jungle itself seemed to erupt in fire and smoke. McKay didn't wait to assess the damage. He opened fire on the eastern flanking squad, which had frozen at the sound of the explosion, silhouetted perfectly against the lighter green of the understory vegetation. He dropped 3 men in quick succession, worked the bolt, fired again, dropped a 4th. The survivors went aground, returning fire, but they were shooting blind, panicked. McKay shifted his aim to the western flanking squad, which was trying to advance under the cover of the chaos. 2 more shots. 2 more men down. Then he grabbed his rifle and moved again, scrambling 20 yards back into the left, getting clear of his firing position before the Japanese could coordinate their response. He could hear officers shouting orders, try to regain control, trying to organize a coherent counterattack. But they were fighting in terrain they didn't know, against an enemy they couldn't see, and every second they spent organizing was another second decay used to reposition and reload. Lieutenant Takahashi stared at the carnage in the pass and felt something he hadn't felt since the early days in China: doubt. The grenade trap had killed 7 men outright and wounded 5 more. Combined with the sniper fire, he'd lost more than 20 soldiers in less than 10 minutes. 20 men, nearly a quarter of his company. And he still didn't have a clear picture of what he was facing. Was it 1 sniper? 5? 10? Were there machine gun nests he hadn't detected? Was this a prepared defensive position, or just opportunistic resistance? The uncertainty was worse than the casualties. Takahashi had been taught that certainty was a foundation of tactics. Know your enemy. Know the terrain. Know your objective. Execute with precision. But this situation violated all those principles. He knew nothing except that men kept dying and the pass remained blocked. He made a decision born of frustration and growing desperation. He would commit everything, all remaining squads, all at once, from multiple angles. Someone would get through. Someone would kill this invisible enemy. And then the advance could continue. He gave the orders. 60 men, the entire remainder of his force, prepared to assault the pass simultaneously. McKay saw them massing through gaps in the jungle canopy and knew this was it, the final push. Everything the Japanese had left, coming at once. 60 men against one. The math was brutal and simple. He couldn't kill them all, couldn't even slow them all, but maybe he didn't have to. He'd been checking his watch periodically, tracking time. It had been 47 minutes since Captain Holland's withdrawal order. The trucks at the depot would be loaded by now. They'd be starting to roll. If McKay could hold for another 30 minutes, maybe 40, the wounded would be clear, the supplies would be evacuated, and the depot could be destroyed to deny it the enemy. 40 minutes. McKay had 32 rounds left, 2 grenades, 1 bayonet, and a lifetime of experience dealing with impossible situations in unforgiving environments. In the lumber camps, when a tree started falling the wrong way, you didn't panic. You calculated. You looked for options. You made the best choice available and committed completely. McKay looked at the terrain, at his ammunition, at the approaching enemy force, and he made a calculation. He couldn't win this fight, but he could make it so expensive, so costly, so bloody that the Japanese would be too weakened to continue the advance even if they did kill him. That would be enough. That would mean something. The assault came like a storm. 60 men moving through jungle and up the pass, firing as they advanced, grenades arcing through the air, officers screaming orders. The entire force committed to overwhelming the defender through sheer volume of fire and flesh. McKay met them with methodical precision. He fired from one position, 3 shots, 3 hits, then moved before a turn fire to find him. Fired from another position, 2 shots, 2 hits, then moved again. He used the jungle the way a boxer uses footwork, never staying still, always moving, always making himself a difficult target. His Springfield cracked again and again, each shot carefully aimed despite the chaos, despite the bullets snapping past his head, despite the grenades exploding close enough to shower him with dirt and debris. He moved through his mental map of the terrain without thinking, instinct and experience guiding his feet. Behind this tree, over that log, through that gap in the bamboo. Every position chosen for its field of fire and its escape route. Every shot taken with the knowledge that it might be his last. Men fell. The Japanese kept coming. McKay's rifle grew hot, the barrel almost burning his hand. His shoulder ached from the constant recoil. His ears rang from the sustained gunfire. None of it mattered. He kept moving, kept shooting, kept killing. A Japanese soldier broke through on the eastern flank, appearing suddenly through the undergrowth 15 feet from McKay's position. The man raised his rifle, but McKay was faster, pulling his bayonet and lunging forward in one smooth motion. The blade went in under the soldier's rib cage, angled up toward the heart. The man gasped, eyes wide with shock, and collapsed. McKay pulled the blade free, turned, and fired his rifle one-handed at another soldier approaching from the left. The shot went wide, but close enough to make the soldier dive for cover. McKay used a moment to reload, dropping his empty clip and slamming in a fresh one with practiced speed. 5 rounds left in his ammunition supply. 5 rounds. He'd killed or wounded more than 30 men. The math was catching up to him. The jungle around McKay's position was now so saturated with enemy soldiers that movement was becoming impossible. Everywhere he turned, there were Japanese infantry, some dying, some wounded, many still combat effective and desperately searching for the man who turned their advance into a nightmare. McKay fired his last 5 rounds in rapid succession, not bothering to move between shots because there was nowhere left to move. 5 shots, 4 hits, 1 miss. Then the Springfield's bolt locked back on an empty chamber, and McKay was out of ammunition. He dropped the rifle and pulled his 2 remaining grenades. A Japanese soldier spotted him, shouted, raised his weapon. McKay threw the first grenade directly at the man. It bounced off the soldier's chest and detonated a second later, killing him and 3 others nearby. McKay threw the second grenade into a cluster of soldiers trying to flank him from the right. The explosion was followed by screams. Then McKay was out of explosives, out of options, out of everything except the bayonet in his hand, and the absolute certainty that he'd done enough. The trucks were away by now. The wounded were safe. The depot would be evacuated or destroyed. He'd bought the time, paid the price, finished the job. A Japanese officer appeared through the smoke, sword drawn, moving toward McKay with the focused intensity of a man who'd found his target at last. McKay raised the bayonet, shifted his weight into a fighting stance his army instructors would have recognized, and prepared to die the way he'd lived, on his feet, facing the enemy, giving everything until there was nothing left to give. The officer was 5 feet away when the jungle erupted in automatic weapons fire. Not Japanese fire. American. Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, the distinctive rattle of a .30 caliber machine gun. The Japanese officer jerked and spun as bullets tore through him. All around McKay, enemy soldiers were falling, caught in a devastating crossfire from elevated positions on both sides of the pass. McKay dropped flat, pressing himself into the mud, trying to understand what was happening. Through the chaos and smoke, he heard a voice he recognized. Captain Holland, shouting orders, directing fire, coordinating an assault. The captain had brought the company back. They'd heard the sustained gunfire, realized McKay hadn't retreated, understood what he was trying to do, and come back to support him. The Japanese force, already battered and demoralized from fighting McKay, broke completely under the fresh assault. Those who could run did, abandoning their weapons and wounded in their desperation to escape the killing ground the pass had become. Those who couldn't run surrendered or died. In less than 5 minutes, it was over. Captain Holland found McKay still lying in the mud, still gripping the bayonet, unable to quite process that he was alive. The captain knelt beside him, put a hand on his shoulder and said, "You stupid, brave son of a bitch. I gave you a direct order to retreat." McKay looked up at him, exhausted beyond words, and managed to say, "Trucks get clear?" Holland nodded. "Every last one. 300 wounded evacuated. Supplies destroyed, so the enemy can't use them. The depot's gone, but our people are safe." McKay closed his eyes. Then it was worth it. Holland helped him to his feet, supported him when his legs threatened to give out, and together they walked back down the pass through the scattered bodies of 52 Japanese soldiers that McKay had killed or mortally wounded over the course of 73 minutes of sustained combat. 52 men, 1 soldier, 1 rifle, 1 impossible decision to stay when everyone else had left. The medics descended on McKay immediately, checking him for wounds. Somehow, miraculously, he'd survived the entire engagement with only minor injuries, cuts, bruises, a gash on his forearm from a piece of shrapnel, ringing ears, and the deep bone weariness that came from pushing the human body and mind beyond their normal limits. He should have died a dozen times over. But the same skills that kept him alive in the Oregon forests, patience, precision, reading terrain, staying calm under pressure, had kept him alive in the jungle. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. The official report filed by Captain Holland described McKay's actions as an extraordinary display of tactical skill and personal courage that prevented a significant enemy force from capturing critical supplies and inflicting casualties on evacuating wounded personnel. The report recommended McKay for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation worked its way up the chain of command, through battalion, through regiment, through division. It reached the desk of General Douglas MacArthur himself, who read it, signed it, and sent it forward to Washington. 10 months later, in a ceremony at Fort Lewis, Washington, Private First Class Daniel McKay stood at attention, while a general he'd never met pinned the Medal of Honor on his uniform and shook his hand. The citation read, For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while engaged in action against enemy Japanese forces. When his unit was ordered to withdraw in the face of overwhelming opposition, Private First Class McKay voluntarily remained in his position to cover the withdrawal and protect the evacuation of wounded personnel from a forward supply depot. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Private First Class McKay single-handedly engaged the enemy force, killing 52 enemy soldiers and halting their advance long enough to ensure the successful evacuation of 300 wounded men and critical supplies. His extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty reflect great credit upon himself and the armed forces of the United States. McKay went back to Oregon after the war ended. He didn't talk about Wairopi Pass, didn't give interviews, didn't write memoirs. He just went back to the forests, back to the timber camps, back to the work he'd known before the war interrupted. The Medal of Honor went into a drawer. He married a schoolteacher named Alice who knew he'd been a soldier, but never asked about the details because she could see in his eyes that some things were better left in the past. They had 2 children. McKay taught them about the forest, about patience, about doing your job without complaint, about standing firm when things got hard. He never told them about the past. They learned about it from other people, from newspaper articles dug up by curious teachers, from veterans who recognized their father's name. When they asked him about it, was it true? Did you really kill 52 men? Did you really stay when everyone else left? McKay would look uncomfortable and say, "War's not something to celebrate. I did what needed doing. That's all." But Alice, who'd lived with him for decades, who'd held him through the nightmares that came less frequently as the years passed but never completely stopped, who'd seen him wake in the night reaching for weapons that weren't there, she understood. McKay hadn't stayed at Wairopi to be a hero. He'd stayed because 45 men had died at Camusi River, and he couldn't live with more men dying because of retreating when staying might make a difference. He'd stayed because 300 wounded soldiers deserved a chance to live. He'd stayed because someone had to, and he happened to be there. McKay died in 1979, 57 years old, from injuries sustained when a tree fell wrong and crushed his chest. He lingered for 3 days in the hospital, long enough for his children and grandchildren to gather, long enough to tell Alice he loved her one more time, long enough to close his eyes and let go. They buried him in the cemetery outside Alcee with full military honors. Veterans from across the country attended. Men who'd served with him. Men who'd heard his story. Men who understood that what McKay had done at Wairopi Pass was more than just tactical brilliance or individual courage. It was the embodiment of what it meant to be a soldier. Not the glory or the medals or the recognition, but the simple, terrible willingness to stand in the gap when standing meant dying. To pay whatever price was necessary so that others could live. McKay's Medal of Honor is displayed in the Oregon State Capitol in Salem. Thousands of people pass it every year, pause to read the citation, feel a moment of respect or awe, and then move on. Most don't understand what that medal really represents. It's not about killing 52 enemy soldiers, though that accomplishment stands alone in its lethal efficiency. It's about the choice. The choice to disobey when obedience meant more death. The choice to trust your own judgment, your own understanding of the terrain and the tactical situation, over orders given by someone who wasn't there. The choice to value the lives of wounded men you'd never met over your own survival. McKay made that choice in the span of seconds after Captain Holland's withdrawal order. He assessed the situation, calculated what needed to happen, understood the cost, and decided the math was worth it. 300 lives in exchange for 1. 52 enemy dead to prevent more Allied deaths. Time bought with blood and bullets in the steady hands of a man who'd learned in the Oregon forest that sometimes the only way out is through. Military historians still study the engagement at Wairopi Pass. It's taught in tactical courses as an example of effective use of terrain in a defensive action. Infantry officers analyze McKay's positioning, his movement patterns, his ammunition discipline. They calculate fields of fire and overlapping kill zones. They discuss how one properly positioned soldier with adequate ammunition and clear sight lines can hold terrain against numerically superior forces for a limited but tactically significant period. But the real lesson isn't tactical. The real lesson is about initiative, about the courage to make decisions when circumstances demand action, but orders fail to account for ground truth. McKay had perfect information about the tactical situation. He was there in the terrain, watching the enemy approach, and his judgment told him that retreating meant condemning 300 wounded men to death or capture. So he stayed. He trusted himself when trust in self meant potential death. And because he made that choice, because he had the skills and courage to execute it, 300 men lived who otherwise would have died. That's not just courage. That's leadership at the most fundamental level. Leadership isn't rank or position. It's taking responsibility for outcomes when outcomes matter more than following orders. The Japanese survivors of Wairopi Pass, interviewed by Allied intelligence officers after the war, described the engagement as fighting a ghost and the most terrifying combat experience of the war. They spoke of an enemy who appeared impossible to pin down, who killed with mechanical precision, who seemed to know the terrain better than they did despite being a foreigner in that jungle. Lieutenant Takahashi, who survived the war and returned to Japan, wrote in his memoir that he fought against American, British, Australian, and Chinese forces throughout the Pacific, and none had impressed him as much as a lone soldier at Wairopi. He was not lucky, Takahashi wrote. He was skilled. He understood that terrain is a weapon, that patience is armor, that discipline is worth more than courage. We had more men, more weapons, more supplies. He had knowledge, and knowledge won. It's a remarkable admission from an enemy combatant, and it speaks to the fundamental reality of what McKay accomplished. He didn't win through superior firepower. He won through superior understanding of the environment and the tactical situation, through the ability to remain calm and focused while everything around him was chaos and death, through the accumulated wisdom of 8 years working in forests where one mistake meant permanent consequences. McKay's grandchildren ask questions about him now, questions their own parents never dared ask. They want to know what he was like, what he thought about, whether he was haunted by what he'd done. Alice, in her 90s now, tells him the truth as she understands it. She says their grandfather was the calmest man she ever met, and also the saddest, that he could spend a whole day in the forest and come back looking at peace, but that sometimes she'd catch him staring at nothing with an expression that broke her heart. She tells him that McKay never celebrated his Medal of Honor, never displayed it, never mentioned it unless directly asked. She says he told her once, late at night after a nightmare had woken them both, that the medal wasn't for killing 52 men. It was for the 300 who lived. That was the part that mattered to him. Not the death he dealt, but the life he preserved. Alice tells the grandchildren that their grandfather was a good man who did terrible things in terrible circumstances, and that both those facts are true and neither cancels out the other. She says war reveals what people are made of, and McKay was made of something strong and true and unbreakable. And when they ask if he was a hero, Alice says he would have said no, but everyone who made it off that mountain, because he stayed, would say yes. And they'd be right. The pass at Wairopi still exists, though the jungle has long since reclaimed it. The trail is overgrown now, used occasionally by locals but mostly forgotten by history. The bodies are gone, buried in war cemeteries or returned to Japan decades ago. No monuments mark the spot where Daniel McKay made his stand. No plaques commemorate the engagement. The jungle remembers nothing. The trees that watched it happen have fallen and rotted and been replaced by new growth. But the story remains. It remains in military history texts and in the memories of the families whose fathers and grandfathers were on those evacuation trucks. It remains in the Medal of Honor displayed in Salem and in the official records filed in the National Archives. Most importantly, it remains as a reminder that wars are won not just by generals and strategies and superior resources, but by individual soldiers who, when faced with impossible choices, decide that some things are worth any price. McKay decided that 300 lives were worth his one. He was willing to pay that price completely. That he survived to collect his medal, to go home, to live a full life, was fortune. But the willingness to pay the price whether fortune favored him or not, that was character. That was heroism. That was Daniel McKay. If this story moved your heart, even once subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him.